Hey there, my name is Matt. I can't be with you live for Pando Horizons. I'm so sad, but that's okay. You're getting me in high quality, recorded HD, whatever, from the other side of the world. So I'm excited to be here. I hope the conference is amazing, and looking forward to diving into this topic with you. So for those who aren't familiar with me, I talk about a lot on LinkedIn where I'm very present, but I'm a big fan of pay transparency. So in today's session, I'm going to talk through how you and your company might be able to consider whether or not pay transparency is right from you and help shift from pay secrecy to pay success through pay transparency as well. So let's dive on in. Firstly, let me start with a little bit about who I am and my background and how I got to where I am today. So my name is Matt. If you couldn't tell by my accent and obviously the time zone constraints, I am in Australia, where I am very fortunate to live by the beach. My background has been spent leading people operations teams across a range of different industries. But where I would say I have spent the bulk of my time has been predominantly within the technology space and mostly global roles as well. So looking after teams and employees that span more than just Australia, which has been a very interesting and exciting experience. The last in-house role that I had, I worked for a company called Oyster HR, which was absolutely the most insane experience because our company, when I was there, went from about 250 people to 650 in 70 countries. It was also an environment where we were rampantly pay transparent. So yeah, I can kind of share some of the experiences, not only from that one, but from other examples of where pay transparency has been delivered in an environment that was not only very complex, just logistically, but also culturally as well. And when I left my time at Oyster and running people operations teams for other companies, I kind of decided, unlike many HR people, that actually comp is pretty fun. There's a question mark there because sometimes it ain't. But yeah, I found compensation is really fun. I really enjoy it. And I also found that it is something that is incredibly hard to get right. So a lot of people tend to reach out asking for help when it comes to compensation. And so that felt like a bit of a gap in the market for me. And I decided to start my own business. So I now run a solopreneur consultancy called Foundation. That's what FNDN stands for. And I'm really focused on helping startups get compensation, done right and make practices that are clear, fair, and competitive for their people as well. All right, let's dive on in. So this is obviously going to work way better in a live environment, but I wanted to keep this slide in here because I have run it in a live environment. And if for those of you that are watching, want to put your hand up or drop something in the chat, because I know that this is being streamed live, I'd just love to take the chance to illustrate to everyone who's watching this at the moment how many people there are that have had a pay experience where it's felt that it's been unfair. And I think doubly so, it's interesting when it's, often I present this to a room full of heads of people. And I always find it really interesting when it's the people themselves who are often credited with building or running some of these practices that are having those same experiences themselves, which just tells you that we haven't got these things right yet. So everyone does have the experience. Sadly, it is the norm. But I think having done pay transparency a fair bit, I often find that in the absence of information, people tend to assume the worst. So even when pay practices are amazing, the fact that they're kind of felt like they're a little bit black boxy to the majority tends to mean that people assume that they're not being paid fairly. So it's just the baseline experience people have. The main reason people have unreasonable expectations, I think, is because they don't know what reasonable is. And that's another reason why I'm such a big fan of pay transparency, is that I know there's a lot of companies that actually do a really great job when it comes to pay. They don't do a very good job of telling people. And so I think for me, that's where pay transparency is often a win-win, is that companies are often doing the right thing and people want to know more about it. So, hey, why not, lift the veil and make this something that everyone appreciates and understands is being done fairly and accurately. All right, the thing I love to start with when it comes to pay transparency is just getting on the same page about what actually is pay transparency. So in my experience, a lot of people tend to think that pay transparency is when everyone can see everyone else's salary. And whilst this is a form of pay transparency, it's not the only form of pay transparency. This is actually fundamentally what pay transparency is. So it's when a company shares the value it places on a role with the individual associated with that role. So if you think of in the scenario or circumstance of a candidate, it's sharing with them the salary for the job. If it's a person within your company, it's helping them understand the range or the value associated with their position. That fundamentally is what pay transparency is. But it can also be when everyone can see everyone else's salary. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of Buffer as a company. They're probably the most prominent example of the most extreme form of pay transparency, which I think tends to be why people's understanding is kind of anchored to that. But it's not the only. And so interestingly, if both things can be true, it starts to kind of create a little bit of this concept of what pay transparency is, which is that it's a spectrum. So let's take a look at the spectrum. This is the pay transparency spectrum. This is pay transparency within most modern organizations. And for me, I feel like there are about 10 levels. So it kind of spans from nobody knows anything. And in fact, we don't even have anything in place. I've worked in companies where, we don't have a comp philosophy. We don't have a job level framework. We're kind of just throwing stuff at a wall when it comes to compensation and seeing if it sticks. That can be a common scenario, and then all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is that sort of buffer environment that I mentioned, where not only are we sharing the salary details to do with everybody internally to the business, but we're also actually sharing them externally as well, which is just the most extreme form of pay transparency. But yeah, for those who aren't familiar, you can actually jump onto Buffer's website now and you can go and look at what their CEO gets paid, anyone else in the business, it's all there. But so too is the reasoning behind how the numbers have been determined as well, which is the most interesting part of this. This spectrum is obviously incredibly helpful for a couple of reasons. One is that if pay transparency is something that's important to you as an organization, it's a really great way to go, okay, well, where are we today? How do we work out, what today's circumstance looks like? But super relevant to today's session is that it can also actually be used to help us plot the future. What do we want to be? Where do we want to go as a company? And how do we actually pave the roadmap for us to get there as well? So let's start talking a little bit about the path to that. So before we dive into where we are as a company on the pay transparency spectrum and maybe where we want to be, I think it's always really helpful to look at the kinds of impacts it's having for businesses all around the world. So pay transparency isn't a novel concept. It's been around for a really long time. I mean, Buffer themselves, I think, have been doing it for well over a decade. So what is cool with that is that even though it's still a little bit of a novel concept, is that actually we've got some incredibly robust data sets around the types of impacts that it's having for organizations as well, and whether or not it's actually helping or hindering some of the really key talent spaces that we look at. So let's look at them. Let's look at some of the upside, some of the competitive advantages that come with pay transparency for organizations. I like to look at it through two lenses. So we're trying to attract and retain talent as an organization. So let's look at it in those two specific ways. So when we're trying to attract talent, pay transparency has really got some incredibly well-documented, well-demonstrated benefits when it comes to hiring. So there's a lot of data out there that shows that candidates are more likely to apply. And in fact, there's actually, what they call this hidden talent pool of people who are actually not going to apply for a role at all, or certainly won't consider it if the salary isn't being advertised on the job at all. So if you think about the kinds of candidates or applicants who are most likely to be in that position, they're probably pretty comfortable where they are in the sense that they've got lots of options. They probably have fairly well sought after skill sets. They're not kind of clamoring for a role. So they get to be a lot more picky about the types of roles they are applying for, and the ones they might be considering are the ones that are being pay transparent. The other part of this is that, those who are therefore being more pay transparent, they're probably accessing that hidden talent pool and therefore also seeing a higher quality of applicant that's coming through as well. So there's a lot of data on the hiring side of things, just in those two dimensions, around how pay transparency is actually really enabling the attraction of talent and that function of the people team. Flip it to the internal side. It's probably a no-brainer that pay transparency is really an improver for things like DEI. You could imagine how companies that share information, take stances like no negotiation around pay and really look to uplift those who aren't clear on the value that they have on themselves and their role and their skill sets, how it can really be an improver for things like DEI. But crucially, it's naturally a really big improver of retention as well. People who are in pay transparent environments stay there for longer as well. But probably the most interesting data point when I was doing research around pay transparency was this one, which was that 68% of employees say they would switch employers for greater pay transparency, even if the pay was the same. Just such an interesting statistic, because I think it tells me that actually the dollar that a pay transparent environment, a pay transparent company is paying to their people in salaries is actually worth more than the salary that's being paid to someone in a non-pay transparent environment. All right, so we've kind of talked about, pay transparency, what it is, what it isn't. We've understood a little bit about the benefit, the competitive edge for pay transparency when it comes to organizations. How do we actually know if it's right for us and, whether or not we want to implement it? So I was saying that I came across, I think it was Josh Burson that penned this. It might have been someone else, but a saying I really, really love when it comes to things that are quite sexy, I think, like pay transparency, is don't fall in love with the solution, fall in love with the problem. What I mean by that is that pay transparency might seem like a cool thing to have. It's very much a sort of du jour, interesting topic at the moment. But don't risk introducing it just to have it and not actually solve a problem. So here's where I like to introduce a tried and tested process, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is the design thinking process. And this is really going to be the sort of rest of the slides here, is like, how do we actually go, what's the problem, whether or not we know this is a solution, and then how do we actually look toward implementing as well. For this, I'd like to reflect on some of the ways in which pay transparency has helped other companies and see whether they link to focus areas that we have for our talent strategy. So for example, are we struggling to attract the right volume of candidates? Or are we getting the volume, but we're not getting the caliber? Maybe the topic of trust has come up a lot in conversations with our people, and we want to improve that as part of our value proposition. Or maybe we just want to reduce the number of questions we get relating to pay. We might be tracking that, and we find that actually it's really, really dominating as a topic, and it's actually taking us away from the areas that we want to be focused. So any of those, any or all of those things could be a problem for us today. And we are now at a point where we're going, actually, pay transparency sounds pretty good. Maybe it's got a bit of a solution here for the problem, but we need to define the problem first. And so your job is to firstly define the problem, know, in a metricized way how that problem presents itself. And your job is to hypothesize whether or not you think pay transparency will help solve the problem for us. So here's a really simple hypothesis statement that relates to the area of trust within the business and with employees. So I hypothesize that introducing pay transparency will strengthen trust in the employer-employee relationship by reducing information asymmetry, demonstrating fairness, and signaling that the organization values accountability and respect in its compensation practices. That might be your hypothesis. It could be something else. But what we want to do is we want to start with that because we want to test that assumption. We want to test that hypothesis through the introduction of pay transparency. Okay, once we've decided what our hypothesis is, we really need to think about the kinds of people in which we're actually wanting to detect this kind of change with. So who are our stakeholders? In the case of building trust between employees and employers, it's going to be employees are your main stakeholders. So defining that group is the best way for us to then take the next step in this process, which is where on the pay transparency spectrum should we be? We've seen, 1 to 10. We know that levels 7 to 10 approximately are where pay transparency start, fundamentally with people being able to see their role salary, but potentially all the way over to being buffers. But I think the critical thing is that you need to make sure you're choosing this level for yourself and not letting it be chosen for you. Not only that, but you also want to help understand what the kind of impacts are going to be when the level is chosen for you. Let me give you a little example. So I have an incredibly broad network within the US. Naturally, in the last couple of years, most people will be familiar with many states have introduced pay transparency laws. And a really common challenge I found for those who maybe got caught a little bit flat-footed and didn't quite take this type of an approach when it came to pay transparency is that they were late to the legislation and meeting the requirements there, but were fundamentally compliant. So they'd share the salary range on the job ads. But the problem is that they then extended a level of pay transparency to their candidates that they didn't extend to their own employees. So a candidate looking at the job ads going, beauty, like we've got, salary transparency on the job ads. This looks good. I'm really happy. But as an internal candidate, they're going, well, hang on, I have to now go onto my job board or this external job board to be able to see what I think my role is worth or what the company thinks my role is worth. Why can't I find this information myself? And so it actually probably worked to disadvantage and potentially diminish trust between the employee and the employer in that circumstance. So you really want to be conscious around the type of hypothesis, the outcome that you're expecting page transparency to have, who is going to impact, but fundamentally you want to involve them in the decision. And here's a quick little way in which you can do that. So if you know who your stakeholders are, choose a stakeholder group. A couple of quick little questions you can ask them to determine whether or not this is even something that they want before we know where our level is asking them a simple question. Would sharing information relating to pay build trust between you and your company? Yes or no? Or, you can do a Likert scale, 1 to 5 type thing. I would imagine most people would choose 5. It would probably greatly improve trust, something like that. Great. The next follow-on one then is, to what extent do you believe salary information should be shared within company? You don't want to make a decision, hey, we really like pay transparency and we're going to go all the way and do what Buffer's doing. Again, you might find that for your culture, for your business, it's actually detrimental to what it is that you're trying to achieve, because a lot of people don't want to share their salary with their peers. They just want to know that the salary structures themselves are fair. So involve your people along the way, use them as a means of saying, hey, we think this is our hypothesis. Can you help us validate this? What are the things that you think would help us when it comes to pay transparency that are going to help us realize this as an outcome? The second part of this is actually going, okay, if we know that we want to be at level 7, for example, or level 8, what does this actually look like in reality? So level 7 is seeing your role salary. What does that mean? Like, is that, I just ask the HR team and they tell us, in reply? Maybe that's actually not going to solve our problem if the challenge was that we're spending too much time answering pay questions. Maybe we need to build something where people can view it. This is really where you start to get into the nitty gritty and the co-design of working with your stakeholders to actually understand what your chosen pay transparency level looks like in reality. So spend time co-designing, prototyping, doing all of those things in that design thinking structure and process to really make sure you're landing on initiatives and outcomes that are going to help you hit your hypothesis and land the outcome that you're looking for. Now let's assume you're through all that process. Let's talk about how we measure our success. Now, again, if you followed the design thinking process, you kind of already knew what the criteria was at the start in terms of the outset. What's the measure that we're trying to improve? We knew that our hypothesis was that introducing pay transparency will increase trust with our people. We chose a level, let's just say it's level 7 or level 8, that we thought was right for us. We've implemented the things that we feel are going to give us the outcome that we're looking for. Now we need to do the really critical thing that I think is often left off the end of these kinds of projects, which is we need to measure our success. So we thought that introducing pay transparency would increase our trust with our people. We've spoken with them. We've gauged whether or not we think that's right. And then we've run our post-pay transparency surveys to help us gauge whether or not that's actually come to life. And we're going to contrast them with the pre-pay transparency surveys. This for me is the most critical thing when it comes to launching something as substantial as this, because of course, we're strategic leaders. We want to be, executives. We're at the table. We're having these sorts of conversations. We really want to be able to prove to people that we're having the kinds of impact that we think we are. And this for me is the sort of capstone process that we need to make sure we're running to ensure that we are seen that way. And because of course, the result is that we're hitting the types of outcomes we're looking for, or we're going back and we're, reassessing what our hypothesis is. We're tweaking things. We're fine-tuning things. We're running that experiment again. This is very much the kind of product thinking we want to try to introduce at our organizations. I think the last thing I would say is that, the business case is based on other people's results, not yours. So the justification that you use, the competitive edge that we saw being given to other organizations, that's their competitive edge. That's their outcomes. That's their results. We're really using that to go, okay, we think that pay transparency may have the same impact for us, but actually we need to measure it and we need to make sure that we're seeing that we're actually having the kinds of results that we're looking for. So this is the most critical step, arguably, in the entire process, because they helped us to form our hypothesis there, because they help form the the credibility for us to be able to run future experiments again as well. So I've talked a lot about pay transparency and the benefits, how it can work, how you can implement it. But I just like to always introduce other voices when it comes to these sorts of things, rather than just being me talking about the topic of pay transparency. One I really wanted to spotlight came about from an interview with Paul Stovall. So Paul is the founder of Octopus Deploy, which is a SaaS tech company here in Australia, been very successful, 100 million in ARR, 300 plus employees, and 9 plus countries. And when I had an interview with him for my podcast, this is what he had to say around the justification and one of the rationales for him personally around why pay transparency was, is important. And I just like to share that with the audience.
The worst place to be as an employer is like to actually be doing everything right, but for people to have the perception that you're not, right? For people to have the perception, because then it's sort of like, at least if you were doing everything wrong, you'd be getting away with it, right? Like at least there'd be some upside to it. But if you're actually, in fact, kind of doing everything as well as you possibly can, and people don't know about it, like that's kind of a worse outcome.
So to bring this to a close, as Paul's wise words said, is that if you really do have a great, well-functioning, well-oiled compensation practice, you're actually doing yourself a disservice just by not sharing it, because of the trust that it can create for your organization and for your people as well. So if for nothing else, I think that's a real benefit and a real catalyst and a driver from my perspective around why pay transparency can be successful and effective for organizations. With that, I'm going to draw it to a close. Thank you for joining me virtually in this recorded environment. I am prolifically online. So if you've got questions about pay or pay transparency in startups, you can hit me up on LinkedIn. There's obviously my email there. Yeah, reach out. I'd love to connect. Always happy to chat. So thank you for joining me.